Johnny Tremain, A Story of Boston in Revolt by Esther Forbes. This is Chapter 3, Part 3. Johnny grabbed his jacket. Scylla had not yet put food in it, pulled his tattered hat over his eyes, and stalked out. Since his accident, he had unconsciously taken to weaving his hat at a rakish angle. This, and the way he always kept his right hand thrust into his breeches pocket, gave him a slightly arrogant air. The arrogance had always been there, but formerly it had come out in pride in his work, not in the way he wore his hat and walked. He told no one what he did all day, and Mrs. Latham was convinced that he had taken to, or was about to take to, even evil ways. He did look at times both shabby and desperate. In other words, a potential criminal. Sometimes he looked so proud and fine, people thought he must be a great gentleman's son in misfortune. One thing he did not look like anymore was a smart, industrious Boston apprentice. He walked down Fish Street to Anne, crossed Dock Square with Faneuil, Faneuil, Faneuil Hall on his left. It was market day. He picked his way about the farm carts, the piles of whitish green cabbages, baskets of yellow corn, rows of plump, pale, plucked turkeys, orange pumpkins, country cheeses, big as a baby's head. Some of the market folks, men and women, children and black slaves, called to him, seeing in the shabby, proud boy a possible rich customer, but others counted the parts of butter on the tables after he passed by. Without heeding anyone, he crossed Dock Square, and in a moment's time he stood beside the brick townhouse at the head of King Street. The lower floor of the townhouse was an open promenade, and here every day the merchants gathered on change. Not a merchant in sight. They did not rise as early as market folk. Suddenly Johnny had an idea. Although seemingly he had tried every shop in Boston in search of a new master, he had not tried the merchants. From where he sat on the steps of the townhouse, he could look the brief length of King Street, which quickly and imperceptibly turned into Long Wharf, running for half a mile into the sea. It was the only wharf in Boston larger than Hancock's. There was not another wharf in all America so large, so famous, so rich. As at his own wharf, one side was built up solidly with counting houses, warehouses, sail lofts, stores. The other side was left open for the ships. Already sailors, porters, riggers, and such were at work. He waited, it seemed to him, for a long time, and then the clerks began to arrive. Counting house doors were unlocked. Warehouses were unchained. At last the merchants came, some striding down King Street, rosy-faced, double-chinned, known and greeted by everyone, apparently knowing and greeting everyone in return. Some came in chaises, gigs. Some had sour, gimlet-eyed faces. Some had not yet lost the rolling gait of sea captains. Johnny saw the same gray horse and gig with the arms upon the door that had carried John Hancock to the Lathams last July trot quickly down King Street onto Long Wharf. Although Mr. Hancock had recently bought Hancock's Wharf, his principal place of business was on Long. Mr. Hancock has on a cherry red coat, Johnny thought. He drives the horse himself, but now he's getting out, telling that dressed-up doll of a black boy to put his horse up for him. Johnny decided he would start at the top of the merchants and work down, only, of course, skipping Merchant Light. He'd go first to John Hancock. From where he sat, he could see that a great ship was slowly warping in. No coaster this, no mere sugar boat from the sugar isles. A number of fashionably dressed young men, as well as the usual dockhands and porters, were crowding about to welcome her. There was the heavy clatter of a great coach almost beside him, and a coachman was bawling to lesser folk, "Make way! Make way!" Black horses in glittering silver-mounted harnesses, the rumble and rattle of a ruby coach on cobbles, and on the door panel the familiar crest, a rising eye. Half seen inside, merchant Jonathan Light. Evidently, he had just heard his ship was in and had come down from his mansion on Beacon Hill in a hurry. He was still struggling with the lace about his throat. Johnny left his seat and strolled down the wharf to watch. No one had ever told him not to watch the lights, but he always felt guilty when he did. From afar, he knew them all. He knew, for instance, that Mr. Light had a broken front tooth. He knew Mrs. Light was dead, and 2 sons had been drowned as boys, and girls had died in infancy. This he could read upon the slate gravestones of Copp's Hill. Copp's, C-O-P-P''S. He knew that besides the town house on Beacon Hill, there was a country seat at Milton. And he knew that Lavinia Light had spent the last summer in London. Now she was back in Boston once more. She was very tall for a woman, slender and graceful, and moved slowly down the gangplank with the stately self-consciousness which happened to be the fashionable gait for a lady at the moment. 100 times before, Johnny had stopped on the streets of Boston or before her house to watch her. He but one more gaping face in a crowd, she the accepting reigning belle. He admired her odd, strong beauty which, unlike her regal gait, was not of the fashionable type. To begin with, she was too tall and golden-haired, pink and white-skinned were the mode. She was a black-haired woman. I'm sorry. Let me read that over again. To begin with, she was too tall, and golden curls, pink and white skin were the mode. She was a black-haired woman, and only for balls and such was she powdered and curled. In contrast, her skin was dead white. Her features were clear-cut, enough to justify the poems written to her in London, and even here in Boston, comparing her to a classic goddess. There was only one flaw to her marble beauty. Between the low sweeping black brows was a tiny perpendicular line. Once and only once, the master hand that carved her face had let the chisel slip. He's talking about God. God don't make no mistakes, though, does he? The blemish was odd enough for a young lady still in her 20s. It boded no good for the peace of mind of those about her, nor for her own. Now she, with all glitter and smiles, greeted the young gentleman who had come to meet her. Johnny did not notice what she wore, but the mantua makers, dressmakers, milliners, glovers, and jewelers all knew that whatever Lavinia Light brought back from London would set Boston's styles for the winter. "Ah, papa, papa," she suddenly exclaimed. There was an urgency in her voice, a soft flash in her eyes none of the young men's faces had called forth. Like any country girl, merely glad to be home again, she flung herself into her father's arms. Spiritually, Johnny shrugged, determined to be neither over-impressed nor envious. That overdressed moppet, that lean beanpole, for Miss Lavinia was lean in comparison to Madge and Dorcas, who had always been held up to Johnny as the end-all of feminine beauty. Bad-tempered, too. I hope she kills herself over eating cakes and plum puddings, turkeys and stuffing and gravy, hot white rolls. His stomach was gnawing at him. He forgot Lavinia Light as he thought of the wonderful things it was her privilege to overeat as she wished. Surely by now enough time had passed since Johnny Hancock's arrival at his counting house so that he would be ready to talk to a likely boy looking for work. His mind might be good enough for a cabin boy. Okay, his hand, that is, might be good enough for a cabin boy. Johnny found one does not step out into a great merchant's counting house and see the merchant as easily as one steps into a shop and sees the master artisan. Although he had made up his mind that he would begin his conversation with Mr. Hancock by explaining he had a burnt hand, he did not see any reason why he should explain to the clerk who stopped him in the outer office. All he said was that he wanted work. The clerk asked. I tell Avery not to say that. The clerk asked him if he could read and write. He said he could. The thin, weak-eyed gentleman gave him a mortgage, and told him to read it. This he read well. Then Mr. Hancock, who had been sitting along over his little hearth fire in the back office, came out. He had been attracted by the quality of the boy's voice, for although Johnny often spoke in the rougher, slurring manner of Hancock's wharf, in reading he reverted to the cleaner speech his mother had taught him. Mr. Hancock didn't recognize him as the apprentice of Mr. Latham, who had rashly promised a sugar basin in time for his Aunt Lydia's birthday. And then the old man had been forced at the last to admit he could not do it. Add this, my lad, he said, handing Johnny an invoice he held in one hand. Johnny added easily. He was given a few more simple sums, which he did in his head. The clerk and merchant exchanged glances. Mr. Hancock said, "If your handwriting is as good as your reading and ciphering, I promise you a place right here in my counting house. I've been put to it to find just the right boy. Your writing." I've been taught to write, but Johnny was suddenly frightened. The clerk put out a piece of paper before him and inked a pen. "Write Johnny Hancock, Esquire. Write Johnny Hancock, Esquire." Johnny stubbornly stared at the paper. At last he had found a place where he wanted to be, and he knew that ever and again boys who started working for great merchants become great merchants themselves. Surely, if only he tried hard enough, he could do it. He could write for the length of just John Hancock, Esquire. His hand shot out of his pocket, grasped the pen. The letters were as clumsy as though written with a left hand. The clerk laughed. "Mr. Hancock, I've never seen worse writing." The merchant said, "My boy, you must have been rattled. Surely you can do better than that." Johnny stared at his miserable scratches. "God help me," he whispered. "It is the best I can do." Why, the lad had a crippled hand. "Look, Mr. Hancock. The lad has a crippled hand." Mr. Hancock quickly averted his fine eyes. "Run away, boy, run away. You knew you could not do the work, and yet you came and took up my valuable time. But I thought maybe you could ship me as a cabin boy and carry Captain's grog and be brisk and useful for him. No, my captains want whole boys. So now go away, please." Johnny wandered off. I burned my hand making you a silver basin. Now it is. Go away, please." He flung himself down in the shadow of a sail loft, for the late September day was warm as summer. He could hear the tap of shipwrights' hammers, the creak of wooden wheels, a boatswain's whistle. Everywhere boys and men were at work, only he was idle. He saw picking his way delicately around barrels of molasses, of molasses, bales, ox teams, a familiar, fantastic figure. It was Mr. Hancock's little black slave, Jehu. He was looking from side to side. When he saw Johnny, he went to him and said, like a parrot, Master, my Johnny Hancock, Esquire, has commanded me to give this purse to the poor boy, the poor work boy. Let me say that again. He saw Mr. Hancock's little black slave, Jehu. He was looking from side to side. Oh, so Jehu was looking for Johnny. When he saw Johnny, he went to him and said like a parrot, My master, Mr. John Hancock, Esquire, has commanded me to give this purse to the poor work boy in the broken shoes who just left his counting house, and to tell him that he wishes him well. Johnny took the purse. It was heavy. That much copper would provide him with food for days. He opened it. It was not copper, but silver. Johnny Hancock had not been able to look at the crippled hand, nor could he help but make his handsome present. That is chapter 3, part 3, the end of that portion.